basic router configuration. Configuring host names, the configuration of IP addresses, banners, and interface descriptions, and just verification of all these configurations with some show commands. I've brought up the router prompt, and what we're going to do is go in and get into global mode and take a look at configuring the host name of the router. So the first command I put in here is enable to get me into privilege mode. Now, let's say I forgot what mode I need to be in, or I want to see what the router command is to configure the host name in the first place. What I can do is I can do the show run, and which is short for show running config, and I can go in and take a look. Right now the host name of the router is router, and what's nice about the show run is I can actually see the command in the show run that I used to change the name of the router. Host name space router. Router being the router's name, host name being the command to enter the router's name. Now, the running configuration is how the router is currently configured. There's also a startup configuration, which is a saved configuration, which is stored in non-volatile memory. So if the router were to be shut down, the startup configuration would be loaded to configure the router. The running configuration and the startup configuration do not have to match. So if I make a change that I don't like, I could load the startup configuration and overwrite the running configuration, and any changes that I've made to the router would be gone, which is nice if you're troubleshooting, you're going to somebody's business and you make a mistake, things don't work out the way you planned it, you can just go ahead and overwrite all mistakes you made. And worst case scenario, if you can't fix the device, you can get it back to the state it was in before you got there. So again, I'm looking at the running configuration. I want to go in and change the name of the device. So what I'll do is I will get out of the show run. I hit any letter on the keyboard to get me out. And I'm going to go into global mode. Every command you see in the running configuration, at least you need to be in global mode to enter it. Some commands you need to go to a further mode. So hostname router is a global mode command. So I get into global mode by typing in configure terminal. Now, all I have to do is look at the exact command that I put up here, or that's already in the running configuration, which is hostname, and then I give the router the name. And I'll call this router router 1. By typing in router 1, or hostname router 1, go in and I've actually changed the name of the router. Now, that name change that I've done will be lost if I reboot the router. This is in RAM. RAM is random access memory. It's volatile, meaning I shut the router off, it loses power. So I don't want to shut the router off until I've saved it. To verify that, I can do show startup config. Show startup config, and I'm getting this non-volatile configuration memory is not present. I thought I was getting an error there for a second, but it's not an error. It's just telling me that non-volatile configuration memory is not present. What that means is there isn't a saved configuration on the router. So if I were to shut down, the router would come up with all default configurations. If I want to save this, so if I do shut down the router, this configuration change I've just made will be saved. I type copy running config startup config. Running config being the source configuration file, startup config being the destination, and I hit enter, and I've saved the configuration. Now, if I want to view what is in MB RAM, so if the router is restarted inadvertently, I can go in and I can check it out, and here it is. Here's my command in the startup configuration, so that's the name of the router. If we were to shut down, that router name will be saved. Now, well, that's how I configure the host name. Let's go in and take a look at configuring in an IP address. I'm going to go in and do a show run just to take a look at the current configuration of the interfaces and see what IP addresses are on there automatically. Since this router has a minimal configuration changes from the default, each interface should not have any IP address on there. I've got two interfaces. Interface serial 0, which is for my WAN connection, and interface Ethernet 0, which is for my LAN connection. Notice it says no IP address on each interface or under each interface. So what I want to do is, if I want to go in and actually change the IP address or set an IP address on each interface, I'm going to have to follow the steps that I actually see right in front of me with the show run, and I'll start in global mode to do that. I'll follow the steps and I'll go in and add an IP address to the interface. Let's take a look. Configure terminal, or CONF space T for short, gets me into global mode. Now, I notice that it says no IP address underneath interface serial 0. So what that tells me is if I want to set an IP address on interface serial 0, I have to type interface serial 0 first to enter the interface mode, and then I can go ahead and set the IP address. INT for short, tab it out so I can see what I'm typing in. Interface S0, S is for serial, and it's taking me to the serial 0 interface. I know I'm in interface mode because if we go in and take a look right here, it has the router name, space, or no space, but parentheses, config-if, end parenthesis, and then I have the pound sign. The config-if tells me I'm in interface mode. Let's say I forgot the command to set the IP address. All I have to do is look up here and it says no IP address. So the opposite of no IP address would be IP address. So I can go in and type IP address. But if I just hit enter, IP address, it says incomplete command. So I'm going to bring up my previous command with the up arrow, space, put a question mark. Oh yeah, I'm entering the IP address. So I can go in and it shows me with that help command what I'm entering, or what I can enter, or what command component is expected next. I take a look right here. IP address is what expected next, and A.B.C.D stands for dotted decimal notation, so it's expecting an IP address in dotted decimal notation. So I'm going to go in and put an IP address in there, 192.168.1.1, with the default subnet mask for a Class C network, and I hit enter. I didn't get an error. And remember, with the router prompts, if I do everything right, it's not going to give me an error, but it's also not going to tell me I did anything right. It's just not going to give me an error. So let's go in and set an IP address on the other interface, as well as view this IP address we've just set. Control Z takes me back to privilege mode. Show running config will show me any changes I've made. I always do a show running configure after I make some changes to the router just to verify that they're there. Hostname router 1 I said earlier. Interface serial 0. IP address 192.168.1.1.255.255.255.0. Exactly what I typed in. I've got one more interface to go, and again I can use what's in front of me in the show run to help guide me into setting an IP address on interface Ethernet 0. All configuration starts from global mode. I type interface serial 0, or I'm sorry, interface Ethernet 0. E for Ethernet. I don't have to type the whole thing out, but when you're just starting out with the router prompt, it's a good idea to type the whole command, or at least put the first few letters and then hit tab and make sure it completes it for you. That way you get some familiarity with the complete commands. Ethernet 0. On the CCNA exam, by the way, they do take shortcuts in the simulators. I hit enter, just like this, and I take a look. No IP address. Again, the opposite of that would be IP address. And I go in and put an IP address. Watch what happens if I put an IP address 192.168.1.2. Same subnet mask. If the interface was up, I didn't get any errors right here. And I didn't get any errors because my interfaces are down. If my interface was up, what would happen is my router would look at my Ethernet 0 interface and look at this IP address 192.168.1.2 and a Class C subnet mask, and notice that the serial interface has an IP address that is in the same subnet or network. In this case, it's a network address. So the serial 0 interface is in the same network. That's not going to work for the router. The router is not going to like it when you put IP addresses on different interfaces that are part of the same network address or part of the same subnet address. The reason it doesn't like that is because every different broadcast domain on the router needs its own subnet or network address. That's how the router routes. Having multiple broadcast domains with the same subnet or network address is very similar to a couple of different cities in California using the same zip code. If multiple cities had the same zip code, the post office wouldn't know the best way or which was the appropriate office to forward the mail to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my up arrow to bring up the previous command and change the network address here to .2 network, and that way the router can function appropriately, and I'll put it .1 for the gateway. And that way the router can function appropriately when I enable the interfaces. Here, I've used Control-Z to get out of the interface, back to privilege mode, and I'm going in and I'm verifying the IP addresses that I've just set. So again, I see the host name I said earlier, interface serial 0 with the IP address 192.168.1.1. If I go enter one line at a time, I can see the IP address on Ethernet 0, which is 192.168.2.1, just like I typed it in. I've exited out of the router. And the reason I exited out is I want to show you the point, our starting point from the router. Now the starting point is going to look very similar whether we telnet in, use the auxiliary port to connect to the router, or the line console. Now what you can do is you can put a little message here for people to see when they're connecting up to the router. And it's basically a descriptor you can use for the router, a little it's called the banner message of the day, to give people who are connecting to the router some information about it. Very helpful for remote situations. You're remoting into a router, you don't physically see the router in front of you, large organizations with multiple routers. It's a nice idea to put that there. That way if somebody does connect up or they're telnetting in, they know that they're telnetting into the right device. Let's put a description on router 1 so when people connect up to it, they know what router they're connecting to. I start off in user mode. Get into privilege mode, type CONF space T, which takes me into global mode. Global mode is the mode where I'm going to specify this banner message of the day. And all I type is banner, MOTD, MOTD standing for message of the day, and I'll put a question mark if I don't know what to do next. What it wants is it wants a character called the delimiting character. And what that is, that character marks the beginning and the end of the router message. Now when you're creating the banner message of the day, you want to use a character for the delimiting character that's something you're not going to be using when you're typing your message. So I'll put a £. What I like to do is I like to hit enter after I put the delimiting character, because what it allows me to do is it allows me to enter my message in paragraph format. This is router 1. And I put this is router 1, please do not make any changes. When I'm done, I put a space in there, put the delimiting character again, I hit enter, and notice I did not get any errors. If I don't get any errors, that's a good thing. Again, it's not going to pat me on the back when I do something right. It's just not going to reprimand me for doing something wrong. Control Z, and again, like always, I will do a show running configuration and check out my banner message of the day. And here it is, banner message of the day. This represents the delimiting character, which is the £, that I use, and it shows my message. If I want to see my message in action, what I need to do is exit out of the router. And watch what happens when I hit return before I get to user mode. I get the message. This is router 1. Please do not make any changes. And again, this can be very helpful when the need for identifying routers in a large routed environment when there's a lot of routers is important. So banner messages are helpful for identifying routers. Let's take a look at a couple of other descriptions that we can put on interfaces. These are little messages we can put on the interface to tell people where a particular interface is connected. So let's go in, and when we do this, you got to remember it might not be a big deal to put a description on an interface when there's only 2 interfaces on the router. When you've got routers with hundreds of interfaces out there and you've got 30 routers in a network, it's a pretty good idea. So to put a description on an interface, we need to get to interface mode. Type enable to get into privilege mode, CONF space T for configured terminal to get into global mode, and from here is where I can go to the interface. I type interface, S for serial, 0, and now I'm in interface serial 0's configuration. Again, I know I'm at interface mode because it says config-if. The description command, all I have to type out is DES, and I can hit tab to complete it. It's a little bit different. I don't have to specify a delimiting character. All I do is type description and type something that describes where the link goes. In this situation, I'm just going to put this is the WAN connection and hit enter. Just like everything else, Control Z gets me back to privilege mode. I'm going to go in and check my work. Show run. And right here underneath interface serial 0, I can see the description. This can be helpful when people are remoting in, don't know where it's connecting to, or like I said, some routers with multiple interfaces need descriptions just so you can remember which one goes where. Looking at Ethernet 0, I noticed there is no description on Ethernet 0 interface, so I'm going to go back in and put a description on Ethernet 0. Now, you got to put interface first, Ethernet 0, and the Ethernet interface in small networks typically would be the gateway. So I'm just going to put a little description here. I'm going to put this as the LAN gateway, LAN being local area network, if I need to say that. So I hit enter, Control Z, show my work, do a show run, and I can see interface Ethernet 0, description, this is the LAN gateway. And again, we're just giving people information about the router, so if somebody knew where to come in, or your memory's short, you forget what interface goes where, you can put a little description on there as a reminder. We've gone ahead and exited out of the router, and we've configured a banner message of the day. We've configured the router name, which is router 1. If I get into privilege mode and I do a show running config, I can see that we've also set descriptions and IP addresses on the interfaces. Now, I want to point out that we're not always going to be configuring a router from scratch. There may be configuration on the router already, and we have to change that configuration. Let's take a look at just changing the host name of the router. So if I want to change the host name of the router, I do it much in the same way that I set the host name in the first place, with the hostname command. I go into global mode, and I just type hostname correctly, router, and I'll put router A this time. Notice I did not have to remove the old variable, which would be the command no hostname router 1. All I have to do is type in hostname and the new variable, which is router A, and it configures it automatically for me. I don't have to get rid of anything. If I do want to get rid of it, no hostname router A, and go back to the default factory configuration, which would just be router as the hostname, then all I have to do is put a no in front of that command, and it'll go ahead and get rid of it for me. Now if I do a Control Z and a show running config, I can see that I've gotten rid of the host name on the router. And anything else in here that I want to get rid of, I can do it the same way. I want to get rid of the description on interface serial 0, or I want to change the description. I just go no description. This is a WAN connection, I'll get rid of it. If I want to change it, I just type description and the new variable, or the new description. Want to get rid of the IP address, it's no IP address. So everything in here that I see, if I want to get rid of it, all I have to do is put a no in front of it, as long as I'm in the right mode. If you notice right here, the simple command shutdown turns off the interface, doesn't allow connectivity. So if I type no shutdown underneath interface serial 0, it'll go ahead and turn that interface on. Now there's one more show command I want to go over before we conclude this lesson. If you'll notice, I really like running configuration, the show running configuration command, because everything that I type in that changes the configuration on the router shows up when I type show running configuration. But if I want to get more detailed information or status oriented information about a particular interface, there are some other commands I can check out, like show interfaces. Show interfaces shows me status information about the interface, shows me the description I put in there. I can go in and check that out. Shows me my IP address, bandwidth, maximum transmission unit, and buffer information, as well as traffic information about a particular interface. I can do show interfaces serial 0 to see just serial 0, or show interfaces will show me all the interfaces on the router. Another command is show IP interface, which will show me just IP specific information about an interface. That's why it's show IP interface for the IP protocol. Here I can check out my IP address, the status of the interface, and IP specific information. ICMP, popular example of that is the ping. So I can go in and check information out about it. Now I go in and do the show IP interface brief command. And again, I'm using shortcuts here. Show IP interface brief, and it gives me brief information about my interfaces, namely the interface, IP address, and up or down. And right now it says administratively down, meaning the shutdown command is still active on that interface. Now again, to reiterate, I really like the show running configuration command for a quick look at how the router is configured. Show interface is good to get some information about the router. Show IP interface is also good, but as far as just checking out what I've gone in and configured to see the configuration of the router itself, show running configuration is a good one. And if I want to save that configuration, I can use a copy command, copy running configuration to startup configuration. So it's copy source destination. I take what's in RAM, put it in NVRAM. That way if somebody trips over the power plug on the router or it inadvertently gets shut down, power outage, I've seen people losing configuration information because they didn't save it because of a power outage. I can go in and save it. Now if the power does go off, the router reboots, the startup configuration will get loaded and will be configured exactly the way I have it right now. So we have talked about the basic router configuration, setting a host name on the router, specifying IP addresses on interfaces, setting some banners to identify the router, the descriptions to actually identify the interface, and verification of our configuration with the great show running config command, as well as a couple of show interfaces and show IP interface commands.